What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Pride of Detroit YouTube channel. My name is Miko, and I am once again joined by my guy, Morgan Cannon. And we have a special guest today, our very own Kent Lee Platte, one of the most well-known draft experts these days, the godfather of Raz, as you know, Morgan properly named him before we were talking earlier. So, Kent, we really do appreciate you taking the time to kind of join us, talk about the NFL draft from a, obviously a macro perspective, as well as obviously a micro perspective. And we kind of focus in a little bit on the Lions here. Before we kind of get into the bulk of our conversation, for those of you that may be new to the Pride of Detroit YouTube channel, first and foremost, please be sure to hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell. It's really, really important to us as a channel, but it also makes it easier for you to find our content in the future. Also, if you guys are always looking for more additional Lions content, you can always head over to prideofdetroit.com. There are new articles being put up all the time. Today, I believe we're like some of the owner meetings, right, Morgan? So there's a lot of stuff coming out today from Brad Holmes, from Dan Campbell, and just about the NFL overall, because obviously they're voting on some rule changes. So if you're looking for all the latest updates on that stuff, you can check it out over on the website. I believe Jeremy's down in Florida, like in person for these things too. So
yes, sir.
A lot of really good information coming out today over on the website. But getting back to the meat and potatoes of why we have Kent here today, Kent, obviously you have done such amazing work when it comes down to Raz, and that's obviously really kind of blown up over the last couple years. I think this year was like even bigger than I think I've ever seen it in terms of like seeing guys from NFL Network retweeting it and using it. So first and foremost, just giving you an opportunity just to kind of speak to what Raz is, how you kind of came up with it, how it's kind of how you at least envision it being used when it comes down to evaluating prospects.
Yes, I started Raz all the way back in 2012. 2013 was when I really started doing it in earnest. We had the Le'Veon Bell draft that year, and we get these, they're called superlatives, these big words that people throw around, right? And the big thing that year was that they were calling him unathletic. And I happen to live just nearby MSU just now, but at the time I didn't even live in the state of Michigan, so this isn't like a homer thing. At the time I was rooting for UTSA.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea that he was unathletic was ridiculous. He ran a 4.6 in the 40, which for his size was fine. Is it great? No, but it's fine for a guy at 230 pounds. But the rest of his testing was really good, and he was far from a bad athlete, both on tape and with his testing. And I just didn't like that we use those words with no context, and then we just move on to the next player to talk about. So I wanted to find a good way to kind of add some context to that. Everything about Raz is about making it simple and making it accessible. So the idea is we're going to rate things on a scale of 0 to 10. Anybody can understand 0 to 10. 1 to 10, maybe 1's good, maybe 10's good. But 0 to 10, that 0 is never going to be good, right? It's very easy to figure out. 10's going to be the good one. Everything's stoplight color-coded. I've gotten it to the point where I can generally explain the entire metric in one tweet or one follow-up tweet, because a lot of my work was on Twitter. There's a lot of other in-depth analysis that can go into it, but the intention is to make it as simple as possible to understand. And we've just happened to find a bunch of trends from that. One thing to keep in mind is that this should never be the evaluation. It should be part of the evaluation, but it should never just be the evaluation. You can't look at a score and say, yes, that guy's going to be great because he had a high score. It's not how it works. In the same way, it's not, oh, that guy has a terrible score, he's going to be terrible. That's not how it works either. But you do want to take into consideration the types of players who find success in the league and the type of players who don't, the type of fail rate that you get when you're looking at each individual position, each individual success rate. You want to take those things into account. And it doesn't mean the player's going to be successful based on that, mm-hmm. but it gives you an idea of what your odds are. And that's what we try to do, is get any kind of an edge you can.
I really love that explanation of it, because that's kind of how at least I've looked at Raz, and at least how it kind of fits in, because as someone that was a huge Combine fan, I was always that person that was watching every day of the Combine, trying to kind of understand, like, hey, who's having a great Combine, who's having a terrible Combine. And it's really tough, like you said, when you talk about different body compositions, different positions, different position groups, like what is good and what isn't, in terms of how do we really measure athleticism. When you look at, again, looking at Raz, how should fans kind of use it to be able to at least determines, if a player is going to be successful at the NFL level?
Yeah, so the fail rate in the NFL, I don't think people realize just how bad the fail rate in the NFL is. Fail rate meaning any college player, their likelihood of succeeding in the NFL. There's about 2,500 or more players every single draft cycle, and only 250 of them get drafted. So 90% of players fail immediately, just from a numbers perspective. Obviously, some undrafted free agent guys make it, but just looking at pure math, the odds are so slim as an undrafted free agent of even getting a shot. It's ridiculous. And then you look at the fact that not every draft pick succeeds. You have 250 draft picks. How many of those guys are actually going to be good? And then you repeat that every single year. It's a very, very low hit rate. The good news for my perspective is that there is no stat that is going to have a direct correlation to NFL success. So I don't even have to factor that in because no such stat exists. I've got nothing to look at and be like, well, this other stat shows this likelihood. Nothing works that way. So RAS isn't going to work that way either. We do a thing called stratified analysis, which is just putting things in buckets, to use the most simple way of explaining it. So we look at our success groups. We create a success group of players that we know have found success. I tend to use Pro Bowls when I explain it to folks, just because it's an easy thing to verify, and I have it all up on my site. It's very easy to, but the rates are about the same whether I was doing Pro Bowls or a certain number of yardage per season for rushing, receiving. I did sacks. I did starts for offensive linemen. I did NFL roster composition. And actual starters in the NFL, all those percentages tend to be roughly the same. So that top 20%, that was elite guys, the guys in green that you see for RAS, that's about half, between 50 and 60% of your success group for almost every success group. Whether you're looking at Pro Bowlers for offensive linemen or guys with 10 plus sacks, it's roughly 50% of those guys are going to be the very top tier of athletes. That bottom tier, the guys that are below fives, that's the bottom 50%. It's a pretty wide group there. The bottom 50% of athletes, they tend to be only about 15 to 20% of that success group. So even though we're talking about half of all prospects, they only account for 15 to 20% of the successful players. So the chances of hitting on those guys is significantly lower than it is for hitting on players that have the higher athleticism. So again, it's not a whether they will or will not fail. It's just trying to find the best odds. And if you have a guy that tested poorly, what else does he do to make up for it? What do you have on tape that you can look at and say, I still think he's going to be successful because he does X, Y, and Z very well? That's what you need to start looking into. If you think a guy's fast and he runs slow, you should question his speed. It doesn't mean that you should just ignore it if you like the guy, and it doesn't mean that you should just be like, well, he ran poorly and now he's off my board. Neither of those things should happen. You should look at it and be like, am I wrong? Or is there some other context that I need? Was he injured at the time? Maybe he doesn't play the style of football that I thought he does. Maybe he's running against really slow cornerbacks. We saw that with Tease Tabor when the Lions drafted him. A lot of the guys that he was beating in college ran 4.7, 4.8 when they actually came out in the NFL. And it's like, oh, that's why. That's why he was still successful. He was playing against slow guys.
Yeah.
You want to try to find that context on your own. But you want to take the values for what they are. They're testing metrics, they're comparisons, they're not a golden ticket into the NFL.
And I think that's one of the things that's really encouraging, Morgan, when you start to look at like the regime that the Lions have in place now, where it seems like they've put a lot of emphasis on athleticism, but again, doing what Kent is saying, where they're not just simply looking at, 40 times, broad jumps and things of that nature and making, wide decisions. You look at someone like Brian Branch, who seems to have fell to the second round because he didn't necessarily wow people at the combine, but yet still, like, the tape spoke so much louder than what they saw, in a tank top and shorts, right?
Yeah, no doubt. And you'll hear football people talk about that. They're using the combine and those metrics to confirm what they've already seen on tape more than the other way around. And I love how Kent broke it down with those metrics, because really, like, a microcosm of that to me is the correlation between edge rushers and being drafted high and like their success rate. Like, we've talked about that, where it's tough to find, really impact players, at edge. It's just, more difficult, like Kent said. So that's a cool microcosm. But wanted to ask you this, Kent. Speaking of that, how would you describe the Lions' approach to drafting players, based on their athletic profiles, like under, Dan Campbell and Brad Holmes?
They put a bigger emphasis on it than Bob Quinn did, and definitely more than Martin Mayhew did. Mayhew loved his small, unathletic corners, and he had this huge hard-on for unathletic offensive linemen. It was just his jam. He didn't like anybody that could move. The Lions have done a really good job of building a more athletic roster. I think that Brad Holmes is one of those guys that doesn't so much favor or prioritize the guys with elite testing as much as he does guys that aren't bad testers. You see this a lot more in free agency than you see with the draft picks. I think he's only picked one or two guys that are below average RAS. But in his free agents, the guys that he picks up, they're guys that can do the things he wants them to do well. The overall athletic profile isn't as much of a concern if you're looking for an offensive lineman that's explosive. Get an offensive lineman that's explosive. His agility isn't that great. That's not what you're asking him to do, so who cares, right? If you're not going to ask the guy to do a thing, don't worry about that thing. People overthought DK Metcalf when he came out because of his agility drills. If you were asking him to do a bunch of agile, quick things, you are using him wrong. That's your fault. So don't worry about the testing. It's the same thing for what the Lions have been doing. Holmes has a very specific type of profile that he likes to use, particularly at defensive back. We saw that with Brian Branch. And it's part of the reason that, not so much that Brian Branch fell to the second round, but it's part of the reason that he fell to whom he did in the second round. Brian Branch isn't a guy that would work in every single NFL scheme. He has to have a certain type of game plan drawn up for him. And that's fine. A lot of players are like that. That's not a knock on him as a player at all. People win in the way they win, right? Mm-hmm. But I don't think he would have found the same level of success on any NFL team. Falling to the Lions where he did was a perfect mishmash of the scheme and the player. And the fact that Brad Holmes was okay with the fact he didn't test well is part of why he was available and Brad Holmes was able to get him where he did. That's the trade-off, is you're hoping that guys fall to you. You take that risk. Brad Holmes is just like Dan Campbell. They both got some brass balls on them, so they're willing to take those risks when they need to.
I like what you said there earlier when you were saying like it's not necessarily that they're looking for guys that test like really well. They're just looking for guys who don't test poorly. And I think that's another way that you, again, are able to keep everything balanced when you go back to what you were saying earlier about like even something like RAS should just be a part of the evaluation process. It shouldn't be the end all be all. So if you're going to look at tape, if you're going to look at, again, something like RAS, if you're going to also evaluate character, like all of these things should help make up your total evaluation on whether or not a player is worth drafting, as well as whether or not you kind of see them panning out with your team or in the NFL, right?
Absolutely. And the character thing's another thing that like Bob Quinn had that. He just wasn't very good at evaluating. So the fact that he was looking for higher character guys didn't really matter as much because he was kind of bad at the other stuff. So it didn't work out as much. It didn't really matter as much. But Dan Campbell and Brad Holmes, they're not so much looking for guys that are Boy Scouts, right? They're just looking for guys that fit the type of mentality that they have. I doubt that they're going to look at guys who have a history of penalties on the field, for instance, because even though that's coachable, that's not really the way that they play. That's not the type of guy that they're looking for. They don't want a guy that acts hard. They want a guy who is hard and puts that out on the field every play between the whistles, not after it, you know?
So you're basically saying Shamar Stewart is probably off their list.
He's one of those guys I think that it would be tough for me to think that they would get him. Despite his athletic profile, I don't think that he's a guy that they're going to be looking at as a character fit for their room. If he doesn't have any arrests, as far as I'm aware, he doesn't have any arrests or any big, huge, off-the-field character concerns. But on the field, they don't want a guy that's going to go out there and put his team at risk. They want a guy that's going to go out there and win on the football field. You have a guy like Princey Umanmielen who doesn't have those type of issues, but he's really quiet and reserved. He tends to keep to himself. I don't know with the new coaches whether that's somebody that they might consider still. He's a perfect scheme fit for what the Lions do at end. He has the same type of profile for a lot of the guys that they like. But are they going to be okay with a guy that isn't necessarily outspoken and doesn't hype people up? Because that's kind of the guys that they've gotten. So character is not just, penalties. It's not just off the field stuff. It's that whole fit. I really like Princey Umanmielen. I think that he would be a really good fit here. But that's one of those questions that we're going to have to see answered when they actually pick up the guys they get.
Seeing as we're talking about the defensive line and, again, what fits for the Lions specifically, that is one of the groups that when I've at least heard people talk about, this draft class, that is an area, specifically the defensive and offensive line, that has really gotten a lot of hype this cycle. Is that first and foremost how you see it, and how do you see that kind of, being a benefit? If it is, how do you see that kind of being a benefit to the Detroit Lions, who seem to have, big needs on both sides of the trenches?
Yeah, and it's a pretty strong class, particularly on the defensive line, on the interior of the defensive line. Really strong nose tackle class. strong interior pass rushing class. And we've got a lot of good guards that are going to go on day 2. We've also got a lot of really good tackles that are probably going to play guard. That's a huge theme for this draft class. And the Lions love versatility. So it kind of plays into what they're looking for anyway. Almost all of the offensive linemen in PFN, because I write for PFN also, in our top 150, almost every single offensive lineman is over 8 in res. They're all the top tier res guys, with the exception of Tyler Booker. And there's 1 or 2 other guys that are like in the high 7s that didn't quite make that 8. It's a very athletic offensive line class also. So it fits what the Lions need, and it fits what the Lions have been doing on that side of the ball. The defensive side of the ball, it just depends on what they go for. We know the Lions don't care about positional value the same way that other teams do, so I don't think that nose tackle would be off the board in the first round. Nose tackles are traditionally not super athletic, but I don't know that I would rule something out like that either. The Lions have the Lions' share of the best players to pick from in that range. There's a lot of players in that end of the first round, beginning of the second round, that are going to be impact players from day 1 if they land in the right scheme. And there's a lot of players in this draft class that fit the Lions scheme.
Like to hear that. Love to hear that. Well, that's kind of staying with that theme, Kent. So who are some players that you could like for the Lions at 28? Like, are there any dark horse guys that you have your eye on, or, what's that look like to you?
Yeah, so getting the obvious ones out of the way, we have offensive line guys like Gray Zabel or Josh Simmons. Those would be great picks. There's a nice gauntlet of defensive linemen that might be available. Derek Harmon from Oregon, Tyleek Williams, Walter Nolan, Kenneth Grant from Michigan. A lot of really good defensive tackle or nose tackles that should be available in that range. I'd be comfortable with any one of them. And then, of course, I've mentioned the edge class. A lot of really good edge players here, too. So they've got a pretty good set of options available for where they're picking. The 2 dark horses that I brought up were Darius Alexander from Toledo and Jonah Savaiinaea from Arizona. They both have really strong athletic profiles, but they both kind of fall into the type of players that I think the Lions might consider. And I don't think I went into it earlier, but this is a weird draft class. This is a very quiet draft class. There isn't a whole lot of big hype for guys that are pushing them up draft boards. We don't have those late risers or the post-combine risers. We don't have a lot of that this year. Pretty much everybody is kind of where they are, which generally means that nobody really knows where anybody is. We could see anywhere between 10 guys and more that we don't expect to go in the first round at all and still go there. And these are 2 guys I think might. Darius Alexander, he's your typical interior type of pass rusher. He's got that real quick build, really explosive on the interior, kind of like Onwuzurike is. If they're worried about his health long term, or if they just want to get some more pass rush on that interior, that's a guy I think that would put up to him. And then Savaiinaea, he's a tackle, plays some guard too. I think that he would be a guard from day 1 here in Detroit, probably an immediate starter, and they just plug and play him on that line. We've seen from previous years, the Lions are, if somebody's drafting a player that's not projected to go in the first, the Lions are probably one of those guys. Yeah. It's worked out for them in the past. It's something that we can't write off for them. If they're not trading up to grab a player that nobody expects, they're going to draft a player that nobody expects where they are.
It's unpredictable. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, I love all of those selections. Obviously, we've talked about, like, Gray Zabel is someone that I think, Lions fans have probably heard a ton about. But I love the fact that you brought up Darius Alexander and Jonah Savaiinaea.
I love both those dark, man. Is Savaiinaea the kid that said he loves Panay?
I believe so.
Yeah,
I think that's him.
Yep.
A lot of people love him, though.
He's becoming a household name.
It's just fair. It's just cool seeing young kids being like, "Oh yeah, I look up to Panay Sewell." I'm like, "Dang, man, we were a couple years ago where he was like barely old enough to drink."
And Sewell's like what, 20, 22, 23. He's got half the league looking up to him.
I know, man, crazy. But yeah, I love those 2. I'm glad that, and I love Darius Alexander. That would be really, love that. Go ahead, Miko.
I was gonna say, like, no, those are both 2 players that, again, I think Morgan and I have tried to at least, get people comfortable with the idea that, as much as we see edge as like the glaring need, there's still like a lot of value to be found in drafting an offensive lineman, specifically one that can have some versatility, that can play guard or potentially play tackle at some point in time if things with Giovanni Manu never really pan out in terms of him developing into a top tier left tackle. someone that has that versatility to play inside and then maybe kick outside in the near future is a great addition to have. And obviously, the best kind of pressure that is always talked about in the NFL when it comes down to getting to the quarterback is interior pressure. So as much as I think Lions fans want to talk about like, man, we really need to get an edge, if you can get one of the top 5 players at defensive tackle or someone that can play on the interior of your defensive line, I still think the Lions are winning in that situation, considering where they're drafting at.
Yeah, and I mean this offense doesn't work if they're not able to run the football well and they're not able to keep the quarterback clean in the pocket. It just doesn't. It's designed entirely around the concept that they can do those two things, and we've seen what happens when they can't. They fall apart. So it's one of those things where you can't count on it being a strength. We want to have our guys develop. We saw Christian Mahogany come in and play really well in the limited snaps that he got. But those limited snaps matter because we're looking at it from a fan's perspective, from a coaching perspective. They're looking at it from a development standpoint. Yeah, he had a lot of really good snaps, but do they think that that's going to translate over the course of an entire season? Do they think that those snaps are representative of what he's going to see week to week? This is what we saw with Houston, where everybody expected him to take that next step, and he didn't quite make it because even though he had a really hot start, he never really developed past that. He's still kind of the same guy that he was previously. The Lions do not want to sit on their laurels and let that happen. That's why they didn't with Houston. That's why they brought in other guys and tried to find another way to do it, because they're not going to sit here and just say, well, we're going to develop, period. That's all we're going to do. We're going to force that development. It's not how it works. You still have a football team to run. You got to be able to develop guys and put that product out on the field. And the Lions seem very aware of that. Their offensive line has no glaring holes at the moment, but it's got 2 pretty big potential holes on that interior offensive line. And a third, if you're really looking at Frank Ragnow's long-term health and potential for retirement. And then left tackle is not a long-term thing either, because we know that Decker is eventually going to be either retiring or moving on after his contract. The Lions might want to move on him if his play starts to move off. If injuries start to mount up again, they've had to deal with that all over again. Nothing's a sure thing, and the Lions' depth got tested worse than any team in the league last year. There's no way that they're coming into this draft without some kind of plan that involves securing the long-term future of their offensive and defensive line.
Music to my ears. Music.
Yeah, absolutely love that. And
Sing
obviously,
you did there.
Tune, Matt.
You was putting it down there,
Kent.
Kent. So with that, Kent, I want to get one more idea from you here. Who are some of your favorite day 2 and day 3 prospects that people can check out? Like, can be an overall, question or like specific to the Lions.
It's a little bit specific to the Lions. So I've talked about it before about on social media about how Brad Holmes loves running backs. He just does. It's just a thing. He's always been that way. No matter how far you go back in his career, he loves running backs. You can't rule out drafting a running back even early. It wouldn't, honestly, as much as it would be surprising if they drafted one in the 2nd round, Brad Holmes could do it. He'll do it. He doesn't care. He's got a plan. We don't know what it is. We're never privy to that stuff. The guy that I really like was Bashal Tutin from Virginia Tech. He's the most sudden player that I've ever scouted in person. He goes from 0 to his entire max speed in 1 step, maybe 2. And it's wild when you see that in person, because we love to talk about how explosive running backs can be. But one of the most explosive players the Lions have had was Kerryon Johnson when he first came into training camp, because he didn't need much of a gap to be able to create space. He just needed a little bit of a hole, and he was able to burst through that. Tutin is like that from a physical standpoint every single time he has the football. It is wild watching that. Why isn't he a higher draft pick? Because he fumbles a lot. And you got to get that out of him, because it's kind of important to not do that in the NFL. Absolutely. You're going to lose your job very quickly. But he's so sudden and so exciting in the way that he moves. That upside is just incredible to me. And if somebody can get that fixed and get that out of him, and he stays healthy and gets the opportunities needed, he could be a very dangerous running back. And I would love to see him come here, get a year of training, get some of those things worked out, and then come in and then forget, thunder and lightning. Let's just do lightning and lightning. Just lots of lightning.
I love it.
And blow everybody up. I would love it. The other one is Jack Besh from TCU. This is a guy that I don't think had a whole lot of hype coming into the combine. He had a little bit coming out of it. He didn't run a 40-yard dash. The rest of his training is still, or his testing rather, is still really good. Has a good overall athletic profile, even though he didn't run a 40. Um, but he's really fun to watch. He runs a lot of very different types of routes. He's able to do a lot of different things. He reminds me a little bit of Amon-Ra St. Brown in that regard, where he's not this elite burner that's going to take the top off of every defense. But it's hard to defend a guy that can do so much because you can't just, okay, he's probably going to go deep. I got to make sure I keep that outside contained. I got to keep him on the inside. You can't pigeonhole him when he's on a play. You have to be aware that he can do anything. And he's got the hands and the ability to separate to really become a dangerous receiver in the NFL. And there's not a huge schematic overlap with Amon-Ra St. Brown. Like, this isn't like, oh, we have a slot receiver, we're getting another slot receiver, that kind of mentality. He does enough different things that I could see putting both of those guys on the field and having Jamison Williams out there and pretty much having no way for the opponents to defend that. Like, you've got one guy that can take the top off and two guys who can do anything. What are you going to do to keep them from gaining yardage on you 5 to 10 yards every single play?
I think we might have lost, if Jeremy was watching this video, we might have lost him once you brought up the running back pick, specifically if it could be as early as day 2. But I think he might have jumped back on once you started talking about Jack Beck here. I like both of those players. I think, especially if we're talking about, a running back at day 3, it wouldn't surprise me because, like you said, it feels like the Lions have been fairly content to continue to test Craig Reynolds season after season with like bringing in different running backs. Craig has been able to obviously, survive every challenger that has come his way, but it does seem like the Lions are looking for something else in that running back room, and whether it's another explosive player to kind of help back up Jameer so that in the event that something happens, you still can have that explosive part of your offense. So I would definitely be on board with the Lions again, dipping into that pool a little bit, again, probably preferably on day 3. And I think there's not a single Lions fan that wouldn't be happy with the Lions bringing in another wide receiver. It's, obviously bringing back Tim Patrick was a big win this offseason, but I still think that room could obviously use some additional talent. And like you said, Amon-Ra at this point has enough, years under his belt where it's like you can literally put him anywhere on the field and he's going to still, be productive. So it's not like, oh, if you draft another quote unquote slot receiver, you don't have anywhere to put, St. Brown.
I'm going to add one more just because it's you guys, and there's an overlap with a previous draft. But Damian Martinez out of Miami is a power back. He's one of my guys, right? He's one of my dudes. Mm-hmm. Everybody has their dudes in the draft. But back some years ago, the Lions drafted a defensive tackle, an athletic nose tackle in the mid rounds. And I actually left work because I worked the whole draft. And I left to come celebrate with my Pride of Detroit guys because we got a guy that I've been waiting for. Damian Martinez is that guy. So when we're on the draft day, if the Lions draft Damian Martinez, I'm coming in with poppers and party hats and champagne and everything just because they got one of my guys. So we'll see if that happens, but I'll be a very happy camper if that happens.
Noted.
Well, I would say that's definitely a name that every Lions fan should definitely have on their bingo card. So again, especially if you're tuning into the Pride of Detroit live stream when the draft comes, definitely keep an eye on this on the ticker. So if that name pops up, immediately to jump over to Twitch or over here on YouTube to see Kent's live reaction to that. But Kent, that's pretty much all the questions we had for you. I really do appreciate you taking the time to kind of join us and really walk us through, our first kind of expert look at the draft class this year. Anything that you want to promote or plug that just like let the people know that you're working on right now?
Yeah, my site's still up at ras.football. You can always go up there. We're very close to 30,000 players in the database now. We might get there before this season ends, the way that this year is going. We currently have over 2,500 players that actually have scores already in this draft class. The largest draft class ever by RAS standards by about 450 players at the moment. Very, very large draft class, the post-COVID stuff hitting us. You're always welcome to go there and check out players. I'm on Twitter at MathBomb. I'm on Blue Sky. You can visit me there. Love talking football. Love going over this kind of stuff. Visit, talk about the Lions, talk about this, talk about movies, talk about music. I don't care. Whatever.
Awesome, man. Well, that's pretty much going to do it for us. Morgan, you got anything else for the people?
No, man. Appreciate you, Kent. It was fun. And yeah, I feel like the draft's going to be here before we know it. Hopefully picking Damian Martinez, day 3.
Let's hope. Fingers crossed.
All right, guys. Well, that's pretty much going to do it for this video. I will have a link in the description that actually will take you over to Kent's website, so you can definitely go out and check out some of the latest RAS scores that he's been able to get up. Also, if you, like I said at the top of this video, if you are looking for any more additional Lions content, you can just check out prideofdetroit.com. That is also linked in the description. And if you want to stay locked in to any of the video content that we have going up here on YouTube, like I said, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell. That's going to make it easy for you to be notified when we upload new videos, as well as when we go live over here on YouTube, as well as Twitch if you prefer to watch over there as well. But with all that said, I'm Miko. He's Morgan. He's Kent. Thank you guys for taking the time to watch, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.